should you wish. But ARTNET is a kind of ad hoc institution. It is an art gallery about rather similar to this one, but a bit smaller, in the centre of London, which shows roughly 60% architectural exhibitions and roughly 40% art exhibitions, and draws its audience, an increasingly widespread audience, but one which I suppose is primarily made up of students and people who go to private art galleries and architects working in the various offices around. And it's located in Bloomsbury. And it's very important that it's not just a sort of gallery that has an exhibition every 3 weeks and a private view and you get on with it. We are increasingly holding events somewhat similar to this one this afternoon, where the people who are exhibiting come and talk about their work. We video everything that moves because you never know how much you may want to look back on it a year or two later as information. We also have gatherings of one kind or another where we hope that the people who are talking will kind of knock up against each other. And I think this afternoon's event is a very typical one, but it's also quite exciting for us ourselves. I should explain that in a sense it spans 3 generations of enfants terribles of the English architectural scene. I myself was a student of Peter Smithson, and 1 or 2 people here were more or less students of mine, and lest you think that incredibly incestuous, we did lean over backwards to try to bring up to Edinburgh an exhibition that wasn't just consisting of one London mafia, but that was a series of mafiosi of different connections. And I think it's very important that we have got a little bit of a remnant around here of the New York Five exhibition, which we had in September, and also that we have a bit of a remnant of the Superstudio exhibition from Florence that we had in about June of last year. That we regard ARTNET very much as a place where people from other countries drop in and do their thing, and where the locals come back at them. And so in a sense we've tried to reproduce that situation here, which is where we come and do our things and you hopefully will come back at us. Now there are 8. How I've decided to organize it for simplicity really is that there will be 8 people taking part in 6 set pieces of roughly 3/4 of an hour duration each, so that we each do, as it were, a kind of lecture, or however each of us wants to play it. There will be 2 breaks between after the first 2 lots of people and then after the next 3, so that the thought of sitting in here for something like 6 hours is pretty daunting otherwise. And I'll just very briefly introduce now who all those people are. I think as far as questions and so on are concerned, most of us go through the usual gesture of saying, well, if you want to stop us at any point, please do so. But in order that some of the questions can be discussed at length without the whole thing getting incredibly out of hand, I'd like to suggest that those of you who have more than a sort of instantaneous question, who want to ask a fairly serious question, could in fact write down their question and leave it at the desk, and about 2/3 of the way through we'll start collecting these questions, and what we're looking forward to doing is ourselves collectively discussing some of the questions, because I think you might as well know it, that I don't think, for instance, Peter and Jean have ever appeared on a platform with the Smithsons, nor have I for that matter, nor has Cedric Price appeared on the same platform maybe as Paul Shepheard, etc., etc. So that even for us this afternoon is a pretty unknown quantity. And we may be talking about, I hope we'll be talking about very distinctively different things. Paul Shepheard will start. Paul is, with Will Alsop, one of the co-founders of the London Architecture Club, which is a perhaps slightly elitist, but a very fascinating activity that's just grown up in the last year, where serious papers are read and where serious discussion about these papers is made. It's not a sort of free-fall situation at all, and is very much, I would say, in the tradition of the learned society. But most of the people who give these papers are newcomers to the scene. He'll be followed by Will Alsop, who, in addition to being an architect and working with Cedric Price, has published a lot of things, and in fact is teaching in the sculpture department of St. Martin's, and I think is the person who perhaps most this afternoon would perhaps like to be identified as an art person, if I dare say that to him, as opposed to merely an architect person. Jean Sillet and Peter Wilson, whose work we can see over there, will follow the first tea break. They both graduated about 2.5 years ago. Peter is an Australian originally, and Jean was originally at the Bartlett, and then they both came to the AA. And they at the moment are teaching in a very part-time way at the Architectural Association. I will follow them. My name is Peter Cook, and all of that. And after another tea break, where I'm told these premises are not licensed, so if you want to head for the boozer, the nearest one's across the street, as you probably know. After the second tea break, we'll be joined by Cedric Price, who at this moment is somewhere roughly parallel with Peterborough. And after that, there'll be the general discussion. So oh, I'm sorry, what about the Smithsons? Alison and Peter Smithson will follow immediately after me and before Cedric. Alison and Peter Smithson, I think really of any of us, need the least introduction to you. And I think that the particular work that they've got on it, am I right, Alison, in saying that you'll be talking primarily about that? I think most of us, in fact, will be talking around the exhibits that we have in the room at this moment. Just a final boring announcement about chairs. We've tried staggering up and down the stairs with these appalling chairs. I believe there are some more in the restaurant that can be purloined. Failing that, you'll have to ask at the desk, get a key, go up a steel staircase, but there's always the floor. Okay, I'd like to introduce to you Paul Shepheard.
The lights need to go off, and I think I'll probably have to make a couple of adjustments to the position of the slide. Because I couldn't really say this. What I'm going to do is a rather quick thing to do, which is a retrospective of recent work. I mean, all my work's recent, you understand. It's only the first thing I think starts in '72, and so it's work I've done over 4 years.
I've been asked by the guy in the restaurant to announce the fact that he's selling coffee, cakes, and so on. I think he may even be selling them all the way through, but he's certainly selling them during the 2 tea breaks.
No. Could you make the projector a bit higher? That's right. Now, a lot of these slides are pencil drawings, I'm afraid. They may be rather unclear. But this is something I did in the last year at the AA. And the program at the time, can you hear? Should I talk nearer the microphone? Like that, yes? Starting these things off, you have to go through all the technical bits and pieces. The program at the AA, though, in my last year there was a very characteristic type of program. It was set by Peter, actually. There's a railway line in North London that runs around in a complete loop, and it's always getting threatened with closure, as you might expect. And the idea was that you took this railway line and thought of something to do with it. In fact, it's an extremely unsatisfactory sort of program, I think, especially if you haven't really got many ideas of what to do with it. You rely very much on originality. And at that stage in your education, I don't think you're very cool about originality. It's a very touchy subject. It's something to do with the competitive nature of working with other students on the same thing as well. And over the last couple of years in developing this work, I've come to a much more relaxed view of originality, where the same things occur and occur and occur over thousands of years. And if everyone has an idea that does seem strikingly original, it's quite likely that it'll just be a more recent interpretation of something that's gone before. But we forget history at such a rate that it appears to be completely new. That's a general apology. It's not anything to do with this particular project. There's a prospect, thought about technology in this program. Concorde was taking off in those days. The P-102 and 101 were just starting to fly. And in those days it was even noisier and smokier than it is now. And the other thing that had just come onto the market in the same airliner field was the Boeing 747 jumbo jet, which, unlike Concorde, which is an extension of flying faster and improving a linear sort of development of jet travel, the 747 is merely the 707 made twice as big. It doesn't fly any faster or anything like that. And there seemed to be a way in which progress, gathering itself, had come to some sort of impression that enough was enough, and it had eclipsed naturally. And this is a project for a hotel, which happened to be based on this North London loop line, and which was a load of jumbo jets strung up in the air. I think it's difficult talking right in front of one's image, I must say. And here you see it. Right. So you invent some sort of reason for being concerned about jumbo jets, practically. But prototypically, the hotel had one or two ideas in it which you could use. There were rooms, circulation patterns. The crashed 707 into the church down here formed the residence lounge. This is a roof plan of the building. These are phantom jets, which was another piece of current USAF technology, which seemed to limit in the same way as the jumbo jets had limited things. This is the ground plan. The garden was delineated by hedges, which followed the roof plan above, elevating the roof plan down onto the ground. There were a series of 3 projects I did called America Love Story for the Future. One characterized things in titles at this time. This is in '72. And it's interesting now that students at the AA find that characterizing projects with names has become so easy that practically before the concept's out, there's a name given to it, and it stops development of the thing. But that's an aside. What's going on here is allusion to a Roman stadium. There's a similarity here. This is taken off the form of one of the Roman stadia. And this offset piece here is so that you start off with 4 or 5 chariots and make a mad dash for the slightly wider opening there. Whoever gets through first has it for the whole race. But apart from that, there was a thought about trying to glean architectural facts, architectural relationships from an idea like Imperial Rome. And this is at a fairly early stage of that kind of awareness. And the southern observation stand is supposed to have something to do with American clubhouses on golf courses, the kidney pools and car parking and stuff like that. American Imperial, you understand. The one above was supposed to have something to do with Lutyens and Imperial Delhi. The way in which I was doing that at that time would be to get a book, Bannister Fletcher, a very good book for this sort of thing, and just immerse yourself in reading and looking at images of that sort. Not so much to copy and reuse the images, but to imitate them. These are some column studies I did for the centre part. There was a raised thing down here and a column at the end of it. And this was a column study. I didn't know anything about the 5 orders. I didn't really know anything about columns, in fact, but I managed to find in doing this sort of drawing that the drawing itself was as much a generator of relationships as anything else. Here are 3 more. This is semi-Egyptian, you understand, and here is a vestige of a column. It isn't really a column at all, but it has something to do with column bases. This was a project for a Ministry of Defense headquarters for the Black Panthers. It was sited in New York in Park Avenue opposite the Seagram building. And this is a comparison of it to the Seagram building. That's the top of the building, and that's the top of my building. So it goes down into the ground as far as the Seagram building went up on the opposite side. This is the first idea for it. And in architectural terms, quite simply, it's something underground. And one looks into the ways of expressing this nature of being underground and the way something might come out into an opening at the top. Loudspeaker cabinets, for instance, come out as an opening in a rather similar way. This was the final drawing. A similar thing to this 747 technology type of spiel that I gave this one was that the space in Seagram building is anarchic space. There's a central core of circulation and services, and around it there's blank space which you can use as you will. And that this beautiful anarchic idea was used in the service of a hierarchical sort of American imperialism, I decided could make quite a good opposite if viewed in terms of an organization that professed itself to be anarchic, but by giving them not the kind of space that one might think they deserve, as the Seagram building would have been quite suitable, but to hollow it out of rock and make sure that all the parts of the building were extremely definite. There isn't any way in which the shooting gallery could be the same space as the computing machine room, or that the execution chamber could be anything to do with the book stack. But really the drawing was more interesting than anything else. It always has been. And if that was a general idea, and that was the sort of organizing thing, I'd just like to go through 1 or 2 slides that showed the drawing coming out. This was an A2 drawing, where I was just establishing the kind of things I was going to do later on. When I moved up to do the final drawing, which was twice the size, which was, 1 point something size, A1 drawing, I just sat down at the drawing board and started investigating various ways of treating this conference room with step seating and some sort of pendulous light fixings. And then I continued doing the A1 drawing like that. I think that drawings, when they're in this development state, have the same qualities as unfinished buildings. They are full of potential. You can look at any measly old matchbox type piece of modern architecture, surrounded by scaffolding and activity, and really like it. Until the wraps come off and you'll wonder really what you've been left with. It's like being given a present and being told you have to wrap it up again. And then that drawing went into the final one, yes. This is a project of the same thing, America Love Story for the Future, whose general background was me as a fish swimming against the current. It was the time of Vietnam when America was being reviled all over the place. For good enough reasons. But I had concluded that there was something about the American Western ideal, for instance, that you find in Westerns, where there's one man in a situation which he has to sort out for himself, which was quite appealing. And there was a sort of lukewarm appreciation of this in the way that American cars, changing their style year by year, managed to convey something of the way the culture is progressing. It's the idea that a visual thing, an object, just through being designed with some sort of integrity at a particular time will sum up that time. And in relation to a 72 Chevy, a 71 Chevy might be just a little bit different. You could see the relationship between the 2 years. It's certainly much more noticeable if you look at 1960 Chevys as against 58 Chevys, when Korea had come and gone, and America was embarking on a much more hard-nosed and less romantic sort of development than it had before. And this is a supermarket, which is something to do with this concern for American military technology and the awful truth that all of I was interested in McLuhan at the time, the awful truth that all of McLuhan's things about soft media were applicable to napalm and anti-personnel weapons that were being used in Vietnam. But the supermarket has this other thing going, which is rather easier to pick up on, about how separate you are from the sources of your food. And this was a compound in the middle of the desert with some expression of racking at the bottom for the goods. But there was a way in which I was treating parts of the building, which I can't remember now, but which I must have had a point at one time, a purification plant and a cash desk at the other end are fairly obvious. It was a drive-in supermarket, by the way. This is a road down the middle. And these three pavilions at the front, one was like a pile of stones in the middle of a desert. The other was a sphinx, which had something to do with another desert. That pile of stones refers to the Tibetan desert. And this one in the middle, the top hat, referred to the Nevada desert. These are all extremely spurious ways of structuring a building, you'll probably agree. But when you come to grips with them and don't worry about their superficial character, turn into something that's quite useful to design with. This is the central building of the supermarket, which is the top hat, as you can see. And really, the architectural things in this are the most interesting things to me. The way in which if you have a cylinder, something like that, and you cut off the bottom of the cylinder, and the way in which you might sweep it up at the back, and what extension that sweep would have in other terms. And the idea of a large solid thing with something rather more flowery and lightweight on the top, and the way in which you might undercut a solid thing with a double canopy, say. This is a front elevation of the same building. This, by ludicrous contrast, is a house that I designed for a site up the road that became vacant from where I live. And chief quality about this site, if that was the plan of the site, was that here there was an enormous chestnut tree. And it was a very simple exercise, and obviously I was concerned with all kinds of extraneous stylistic things about chamfered balconies and that sort of thing. But there was something architectural about this idea of taking the space and giving the tree room to move, room to breathe. And finding that once you'd combined that with a staircase in order to get up from one level to another, you were quite casually dividing a space up into two halves. And how one imagined living in that was quite easily worked out in relation one half to the other. This is a project which was the first part of a fascination I've evolved for taking one type, one prototype, and converting it into another prototype. Why one should do that sort of thing comes out in rather longer conversations than this, and rather more one-to-one conversations than this. But to go through the scheme, the idea was that there was a stately home which had gone to seed and been turned into a farm, so that one found pigs living on the tennis court, and one found horses living in the garage block. And the stately home itself was sort of archetypal stately home. It's loosely based on Kedleston Hall, with a central salon, an east domestic wing, a west service wing with a kitchen garden behind it and that sort of stuff, with the stable blocks and other things below. And this stately home had tennis courts and things like that. Now, the idea was that you would convert it into a farm in this way, so that you'd take the east wing and convert it into a broiler house, for instance, so that you'd have a broiler house but stately proportions. It's a contradiction in terms. The stable block, as I said, which was horses living in a garage, and of course the garage could also have been converted from a stable in the first place, so you'd be reconverting something twice. Mobile field is a bit of a throwaway concept. This is an attempt to come to grips with the pig house, designed as though it were a tennis court. Not converting a tennis court to a pig house, but starting out with the idea of a pig house and trying to design it as though it were a tennis court, so that the roof where the apples are and the pigs are rooting about in the asphalt for the apples is divided after the manner of a net dividing a tennis court. Subterranean activity beneath the tennis court, something to do with the absence of reinforcement that a tennis court might take. This is the broiler house, where the building was cut in half, and some rather ambiguous notion about the way hens are controlled in a broiler house was added onto the back. But architecturally, again, you see, if you're dealing with rather simple things in the broiler house, you might have bright lights to simulate daylight. The way you might organize those in a large barn-like salon is quite an interesting thing to think about. This is the last one, the pool house. The swimming pool has a DUKW sitting in it. That's an amphibious vehicle sitting in it. And the house is built on top of the boat. I started working for James Gowan at the time, and circles and things like that were very interesting, really. He would never use them in that way, but I think where one gets one's sources from is like the idea of your body being made of the food you eat. Sutton Hoo was Sutton Hoo was the site of a Viking burial in Suffolk. And a team of British Museum archaeologists dug up the site and removed the remains and stuck them in the British Museum. Now, it seemed that burying somebody in a longship is an extremely profound architectural idea. The fact that you can stand on a piece of ground and realize that this ancestor lies beneath you. Depends what you think about being Danish, I suppose. But there seemed to be some rather more relaxed architectural expression of that. Below ground, it's not at all relaxed, of course, because it's air-conditioned and has to keep keep the timbers in good shape. But there's a sort of corpus of how to do underground things in concrete, which helps you out in this situation. And over that, the effort of doing all that raises the ground by perhaps 2 inches. You know, after you dig a grave, say, and you put the earth back on top of the body, you get a little bit more earth. And it was just that level of disturbance of the earth which I thought was appropriate to Sutton Hoo, rather than the wholesale evacuation of anything that really meant the place, anything that really gave the place its meaning, and erecting some sort of shed to be a museum to hold the things that were there. Earlier I was talking to the students of the Art College, University, the architectural department, and so some of these examples are familiar to them, but in that one of Sutton Hoo there was this thing about how you might design a place for contemplation. Now, designing a place for contemplation, I think, is a hair-raising idea, not something you'd really want to get involved in, you know, doing a meditation cell for an ashram or something. There's nothing there which you can really work with. You're creating illusions of secure space or something. And it has struck me that in going to see St. Paul's Cathedral, which is London's finest Baroque building, one's only dimly aware that Wren had designed it as a cathedral in the first place. That was the only reason it got built, the only reason the money went into it. But from this end of time, 250 years later, the place is just a place of contemplation. It doesn't matter what gave rise to the program in the first place to have the building built. As it stands, that's how you can take it at face value. This is rather different from all that. This is a houseboat that I found myself in the lucky possession of, and there were one or two ideas for working out roofs for this houseboat, and the first one I'd thought of was simply to put a roof all the way across the top. But that wasn't very satisfactory because it didn't have qualities of boat that seemed to be necessary in its mooring, because all the others are boats true and fast. And there were a couple of ways of getting in through the roof. It's through, you know, opening flaps and leaded panels and things. But the one, and a Surrey with the fringe on top kind of deal at the back there. And very little things about taking the skylights and putting them up to one another, so as to convert it for living in underneath. Later on, though, I had the idea that these skylights could be oriented to the rising sun. There's a division there. On this side of it is the bedroom, and the skylight is slightly tilted east. On the other side it's the living room, and the skylight is slightly tilted west. Which seemed quite nice in a houseboat which is facing north-south, because houseboats should move. The thing at the back is a cover over the aft part of the boat. And I discovered this thing that because it narrows towards the stern, using the same planks of wood to make the pitch of the roof means that the pitch itself in elevation gets steeper towards the back. And that was rather nice. That made it much more of a boat than otherwise. Gave you some angle to put the flagpole against. At this point, I was suffering severely from the lack of patronage, and architecture was becoming absolutely the drawing. I was designing all these things before in the sincere knowledge that they would be built, you know, but once the words started coming into it and descriptions of more abstract architectural things came up, the drawings became more of critical pieces in themselves. The ones on show here, in fact, are architectural criticism, pure and simple. They're barely even suggestions for buildings anymore. But this one is, it leads up to the supermarket again. It's about getting your food, how you get your food. And there was this idea about the hunter, a prehistoric time, sitting next to the trap waiting for something to fall in it. And the trap is loaded, sprung, ready to catch the animal. And the hunter sitting next to it has to attend to the trap and is tied to the trap. He's part of the trap. He becomes part of the spring. He becomes the mechanism that releases the animal from the trap and cooks it. And there was this idea that as time passes, food production becomes more secure. And this is supposed to evoke the Renaissance in general, you know, good solid 300 years of rather complacent endeavor by a country that had got its economic priorities sorted out after Shakespeare's time, when you realized that man was in the universe and capable of making some alteration to it and wasn't just at the mercy of the winds. I think England, at any rate, lapsed into this extremely complacent economic grabbing mold. So here's the hunting lodge. All the guy remembers as he sits in his hunting lodge are the scents of the animals that remind him of his prehistoric ancestor. And current times, the supermarket, a weird sort of cargo cult blind building. Cargo cult, I think, is quite an adequate way to describe the relationship a lot of people have to basic things in their lives, like getting food. Cargo cult, as you probably know, relates to the idea of a primitive tribe sitting at the end of an airfield, and every so often a C-130 Hercules comes in loaded with goods, and they receive these goods. The goods demark their culture. They don't really have anything to do with it, and it's a bit like going into a supermarket and choosing your food in similarly typed packages with different illustrations on the front. And I had this idea that buildings like that were blind buildings. So these buildings that had been offered to you as presents and then wrapped up. But I found some relief in a visit to America when I was traipsing about New York, not really knowing anybody, but having this impression that taking a piece of land and laying a grid on it was to propose quite an important conceptual layout to the place. So that every corner you turned, whatever part of town it was, had a spatial relationship to every other corner in the whole city. And this was part of a series of drawings which took items in the city and examined them rather more closely. And this was a New York City block, skyscraper, with its corner relating to every other corner in the city, and its top relating to every other top in the city. This idea that the city was a big mass of potential activity onto which the grid had been placed down like a cheese grater, and everything had come up like that, or a tomato slicer rather. But of course the drawing throws up far more interesting things like that, really. The idea of a building which has a completely blank north wall and space on the other side of it for use, or buildings which are very high and whose function changes more or less arbitrarily, sort of 3/5 of the way up. And the idea that having gone that high, you might as well have an observation platform, and that's the part where you might release yourself into some other sort of expression. And what would happen if you took a big blank wall and put a tiny little window in it? These are designs for Georgian terrace houses in London. I live in a terrace like this, in a flat over a shop. And just thinking of ways in which that type has potential that hasn't been fulfilled, which is really something to do with your imagination fulfilling that. If you came to infill one of these pieces of terrace, then you could use all this stuff. The idea about the end wall and how one might continue the pitch of the roof straight down to the ground and present this end wall face, which is a completely different thing from the other party walls. And you could make a window in it for the first time in this row of party walls. You can make a window. The one above is alluding to the kind of structural integrity that those buildings have. If you have party walls, a stud and brick wall dividing the middle so that you can use 12-foot joists either side of it, and all that sort of very reasonable 17-foot span, which is all right for 3 12x2s bolted together, that sort of stuff. What they could have done if they'd had the same, somehow the same limitation to their prospects, but with the kind of ease with span that we have now. And so what a reinforced concrete frame might look like in as humble a situation as a converted terrace, and how the front wall suddenly takes on this whole new meaning than it had before structurally. The top one is not so good. It's simply the idea that the space is enclosed by the shape suggested by the building next door, and one makes a front wall out of wire netting and concentrates the inhabitable part of the house up to the other end of the garden where the potting shed usually is. And so you find yourself converting a potting shed into somewhere to live in, and the house into the garden. And this is the last one of those three, which is city re-centralized. You take an office out of the city, and if you're not careful, you end up with a glamorous office in a landscape park. It's like you stamp a piece of culture down into a middle of open ground, And you can't stop. You have to landscape that piece of park to make sure that the open ground isn't too strong for the precious building you put down. And this is some idea about using parts of the farm, like the gates or barn-type structures with a high roof and long, thin columns, to accommodate office activity. And a corridor, the office corridor, is translated into a cloister that goes all the way around the edge. Here are 5 drawings in the Architecture Club Journal from that, where the subject was house, and I took 5 narrowingly different degrees of Renaissance house expressed in these names here, 1 to 5. This one's the Oxburgh, which is a late Tudor moated house. The idea, I must just explain that again. There's this 250-year span of Renaissance building, 1 to 5. But beyond that, I'm using that to express a much longer time scale, similar to the trap in the supermarket, of something going way back into the past, and how architectural definitions might arrive, or whether they're still relevant to us. If you have pigs, you have wealth, nothing's changed. I think that's obvious enough. This one is a bit more thinking about how to organize this set of drawings in terms of cliches of the house. Every man's house is his castle. And thinking about a house as an open plan house. And then thinking about open plan castles. And thinking if that contradiction has anything to offer you. And wondering what sort of things you would use from a castle that might define space as casually interpreted as open plan. And the fireplaces, converters of energy, are the ones which originally defined the space, which lorded over space. And the external wall here, which is capable of being walked on, is something that's very evocative for me. This develops into something to do with those Georgian party walls again, which I can't let go. Georgian boot boys, I was talking about them. The Chatsworth, fine piece of late Baroque, very important building, very profound building, full of integrity. But its translation into the house, these serried palaces, with the way in which, as I said before, the end wall is carrying all the expression weight of those party walls, because up till then they're just seen as something that's holding each house up and keeping each house apart. The Kettlestone is an allusion to semi-detached houses, but semi-detached houses grouped together in the Georgian manner rather than in the Garden City manner to form a palatial facade. And architectural things like the strip that's cut off this house, I think are the most interesting things still. You know, the way in which you can characterize a style by little remembered pieces like a buttress, I think is fascinating, or windowsills in general, and how the minute overhang of a windowsill describes the opening that's about to occur in the wall and all that sort of stuff. And in this case, the party walls have devolved onto privet hedges between each house. And because there is such thing as the privet hawk moth, it occurred to me that as the party wall in a Georgian house is keeping people apart and there's a piece of no man's zone with no qualities attributable, except that it's got a lot of weight and can keep the sound down. In this case, the privet hedge is what's dividing the houses, and that's an inhabitable zone, as far as hawk moths are concerned, anyway. This is the last one of these ones, which was Sandringham Royal Palace, bumping up against the Victorians, and all this kind of stuff went haywire. And here I'm thinking, all I had left at that point was a simple change of scale. This is a council house section, which I'd become very familiar with working in architects' offices, where there's a living room at the top, and the space at the bottom, after you've got minimal bathroom and WC, leaves space for 2 minimal bedrooms. Now, if you forget about all that and elevate the scale several times, you find yourself concerned with rather different things. You know, this part, which was designed to make some easier transference between a right-angled brick corner becomes a really significant piece of spatial definition. You've probably heard, well, it was something to do with the ARTNET American architects who came in, and American architects, I find, talk in extremely simple terms about architecture. There's a great blessing in it, but it's also a bit limiting, I think, because you want the building to be more than it is. You want the building to be more than just this space which contains living activities. And so you look at the edges, what became known as the edge condition, which you must be familiar with, and when you go through this edge condition, you do something about the door. The architrave in a Georgian house, which covers the crack between the timber and the plaster, is moulded up so that it catches the light. It makes much more of a celebration of the door, as Kahn says. But that's not enough. I mean, going through doors and penetrating the edge condition and all that sort of stuff, I think it's fairly easy to understand in these terms. But what you do about ceilings and floors, maintain these things, I think is something to do with grappling with these things just at a graphic level, where you're not really informing yourself about what you're thinking so much. And little things like having a flight of steps to cross the threshold become extremely significant. Which brings me on to the drawings I've brought up to Edinburgh. These are preliminary drawings in an unfinished state, but I didn't have time to take slides of the final things. But in ARTNET magazine, which is on sale here, I think, and which is the catalogue for the exhibition, virtually, I decided to use an interest which had come up, which was with Egyptian architecture. I was attempting to classify architects, as I always am, into different types. And Egyptian architecture was useful because it got me out of prototypes. It got me out of thinking of city hall in a long line of city halls, or house in a long line of houses, but into organizations of building type that were sort of commanding, which gave you a lot. And all that's left of Egyptian architecture after the 3,000 years that have passed over it are the tombs, the palaces, and the temples. And in the magazine, as I was saying, I found myself writing a long poem about the East End of London, which was to have evocations of these three archetypes placed in it. And it struck me that if you were in this frame of mind, you could see everything descending from the palace as government buildings, administrative buildings, offices and home office, stuff like that. All those descending from the temple as the public buildings, so from swimming pools to concert halls, as well as temples. And all those descending from the tomb was somehow something to do with living. You couldn't deny it. The Egyptians' overriding concern for dying must have had something to do with the quality of life. And there was something in that about adaptable houses. The Egyptian, you can't imagine anything less adaptable than an Egyptian tomb, except if you think of the adaptable house as something which you start off with your wife, and as you have kids, the house will grow, or as you have different ideas of what you want the thing to do, the thing will change. Presumably that house should in the end also accommodate you after you've died. And there was something else in this Egyptian thing as well about the idea of what a city feels like after a nuclear attack, which is a topical subject. What a general impression of a ruined city would be like, and whether there's anything useful in that, whether you could imagine yourself picking your way amongst the ruins. And the others here seem to talk about ruins a lot as well, and I think it refers to that idea of the building which is full of potential when it's got the scaffolding up, and when it's taken down, it's in use. You don't recognize that potential because it's all used up with the busyness of activity inside it. When it becomes a ruin again, it regains that potential. It's another of Kahn's mystical sayings. That's the temple. These are the tombs, unfinished state, but there was I was making allusion to in these three drawings, they're organized so that everything on the left refers to the tombs, everything in the middle refers to the temples, and everything on the right to the palace, the government buildings. And here's my archetypal translation of a government building. And then there might be a space for gathering and some rather more heavy, undefined space for dying in, I suppose. And this is a very unfinished version of the palace where the interest is taken up in architectural qualities that the Egyptian architecture has. Big blank walls covered in descriptions of important activity. There's two short things on that subject of the cathedral and how you might as well view it as a place which was designed for contemplation rather than a place for the glory of God. In travelling up, Ron and I came across a village in Yorkshire that had a 400-yard green, long and narrow in the middle, with houses down either side of it. Now, apart from things that spring to mind like sheep corralling and markets, in the 12th century, I think, time of the 100 Years' War, everybody in England was engaged in practicing the longbow so that they could be called up to defeat the French. There wasn't any other activity that went on in terms of sport. That was what you did. And there seemed to be this way in which the village summed up that activity. There was this long green which would have a target at one end, and it was the butts, the shooting butts, and the houses were arranged down either side of it. Now that that use for the green has completely disappeared, the architecture retains something organizational about itself which is quite striking. And I think it's this, most of this work is concerned with the way in which architecture does represent relationships in the real world in all sorts of other ways. And because it translates them so completely into its own self, the way in which you actually do it doesn't really matter. As long as the relationships, as long as you know what they are and you know the subtleties in them, what you design will have some kind of strength to it after everything's gone. I think that's it. Yes, it is.
We just got to reorganise the loudspeaker.
Architecture Club in August, which was concerned with the relationship between the client and the architect. The title of this is Iron Ore, Steel and the Euston Tower. Introduction. The area to be covered in this talk is by necessity a background to my own architectural activity. It is my intention to show that every act, whether made by an architect or not, is a political act, and that every person engaging in activity is the inheritor of a responsibility which may or may not be recognized by themselves. I shall concentrate on the activity of the architect and the artist. The link between the action and politics for the architect/artist may be best illustrated by showing the relationship between the image, its effect on behavior, and subsequent connotations invested into these two elements that ultimately result in the formulation of a culture with its own specific language. It is of importance to point out that architects have the choice between consciously using this language or consciously using their work to understand the language. The first choice results in the possibility of a new exposure of a particular aspect of culture. The second choice of using the work as a tool for understanding results in the possibility of the culture itself adding a new piece of vocabulary to the language. In art, Victor Bergin, through the recognition of the central importance of theory, must be placed in the first category of using their work for the recognition and development of theory in order to understand the language as it exists. This allows the practice of art to make use of this understanding, thereby ensuring the accessibility of the content to the exact degree of their choice. In philosophy, Richard Wollheim would be representative of the second choice, i.e., using their work to understand the language. He advocates that art is the feeling that it is all there already, and there is no real need to set the idea down, and that the poignancy lies in fighting with this feeling. By viewing the activity in this way, the doing of the work serves as a means for a new understanding of the cultural language that the initial conception did not expose. I believe there is a third choice for an architect's working method, which is to consciously attempt to ignore the cultural language. This third method makes use in part of both the first two, for it is as important to understand the language, if it is to be ignored, as if you were going to use it. Hence, the investigation of theory, both in the background and the practice of the work, becomes important. The second method also becomes important because if it is the intention to work outside a language reference, the will to do is very often the only means by which anything can be achieved. The third method, which I call the development of a neutral language and communication, is of significance only at the time at which it is experienced, and it is the reasoning behind its use rather than an example of its practice which I'd like to emphasize in the remainder of this talk. Main body. On January the 22nd, 1976, I experienced the following. I was instructed to proceed to Sloane Square Underground Station, and from there to walk to Mitsukiku in Lower Sloane Street, where I was met by David Wright and Maku at 1500 hours. On arrival, I was given a written instruction that informed me that I was wearing a mask, and that while I was doing so, I might take photographs and talk. And when the mask was removed, I may not take photographs or talk. All communication, when not wearing a mask, was to be made by writing. While I was reading the instruction, David Wright hailed a taxi and instructed the driver toward a destination. I was out of earshot. David then called me and invited me into the cab. Before the taxi was allowed to proceed, a felt mask covering the whole of my face was fitted to me. Movement, speed, and photography commenced. After a period of time, the driver was asked to stop, and I was led to a wall while David presumably paid for the ride. I was led, still taking photographs, at a leisurely pace for an indeterminate period of time. Maku had disappeared. The walking was then interrupted by a flight of stairs as I was guided to my left. At the top of the stairs was a door which led onto the inside of a building. I was led up a further 2 flights of stairs, the first consisting of 10 steps and the second of 9. At this point, another door was encountered, and once through it I was instructed to sit on a bench and remove my shoes, which allowed my feet to be guided toward a pair of slippers. I was then led into a room and sat down on a cushion, and the mask was removed. Up to this point, I'd been talking and taking photographs. Before me lay Maku in kimono, and to my right, David. Both were kneeling on cushions. A series of trays were assembled in the otherwise bare room. The windows were obscured by rice paper, which allowed a delicate light to fall on the scene. I was presented with tea, paper, and pen. A series of written conversations took place, accompanied by a Japanese meal, consisting of soup and a fishy substance wrapped in brown rice paper. After 1.5 hours, the meal and the written conversation was over. The mask was put on, and my camera handed back to me. And I was led to the lavatory, and then back to the stairs on the street. I was led to a railway station and escorted onto a train. When the train stopped for the second time, I was allowed to remove the mask, whereupon I found myself to be at Victoria Station. The time was 18:15 hours. I said thank you and goodbye, and handed two films to David for processing. I went home. Comment. This presentation of a situation to be experienced raises many questions concerning security, location, the blind, communication, customs and culture, etc. Each specific element of the procedure creates connotations within the subject of the situation, each of which either reinforces or destroys previous expectations or values. In this sense, the situation is the same as any day-to-day experience that we are confronted by. The difference lies in its intensity, its overstated character, its deliberate reference to events outside our own particular culture and also outside culture. The effect is similar to that evoked by travel in other countries, where the confrontation with the unusual raises questions about your home and your country. The marked difference within the language of objects, clothes and buildings, etc., serves to reinforce or destroy our own view of our familiar living pattern. By being temporarily displaced, our view becomes objectified. I'd like to present the concept of a permanent cultural displacement as being not only desirable, but also in existence within us all. The day-to-day event that has ceased to provoke questions is a result of the development of an egocentric society. The way this situation has been reached is through the establishment of norms or static solutions to an unrecognized changing problem. The evidence that suggests that a more objective view exists has many examples, but none more delightful to watch than the riverside picnic. For it is here we see groups of people arriving with hampers of food and equipment, and who spend hours looking for the right spot to settle down for the day. It is here they are confronted by a situation to which they have to apply values. Each has a view of the perfect spot, and each is looking for the nearest approximation to their conception of it. Where a group consists of 2 or 3 assertive individuals, the difference in perfect spot values can lead to argument that often ruins the day. This example illustrates that in some day-to-day situations, members of the same culture are capable of exerting different values to the same situation. This gives us hope. The situation also illustrates that the desire to fulfill the nearest approximation to one's own values can lead to a disruption that can destroy the original intention for, in this case, serenity. It is here that we can see that the idea of a common culture is proportionally related to the degree of common acceptance of social values. So when one culture threatens another, as occurred in Vietnam, the result was war. Where values are recognized within the individual, they act as a brief which has to be fulfilled. And if it cannot, the individual ego is either shattered or provokes an action in an attempt to achieve fulfillment. It is therefore possible to recognize that a prerequisite of the formation of a culture is the acceptance of common values that change and develop at a rate slow enough to be acceptable to the vast majority. Otherwise, internal conflicts occur which will result in the culture destroying itself. I believe it is possible to say that culture inhibits change. If we return to the picnic on the riverbank, it is possible to recognize 2 possibilities. Either the three picnickers can divide the contents of the hamper between them and sit in 3 different places, or they could toss a coin to see which spot they should all sit in. If the latter possibility occurs, the 2 members of the group who are sitting on an imperfect spot proceed to construct a comparison between one conception of the spot and their own. In this manner, the apparent incompatibility of the situation is used to advantage. The observation will result either in the reinforcement or the destruction of the values of the reluctant picnickers. It is this positive view of situations as they arise, as opposed to the manic destruction of perfect ones, that begin to give clues to a possible architecture. It is this view of society that requires individuals to accept rather than select. It would appear to be useful to construct a method by which situations can be analysed. In constructing such a method, it is important to make the distinction between the methods of analysis and the methods of comparison with an idealized image of what the viewer would like to see or experience. In the architectural context, It is the idealized concept that often forms the basis for action. In an article entitled Client, published in the Journal of the London Architecture Club, I took 4 idealized images which commonly form the basis for architectural action and attempted to show the limitations and adverse effect of each. The 4 were the didactic view, the creation of community, the information process, and semiotics. All failed to be worthwhile due to the vast numbers of assumptions made by each. The point of interest lies in what is to be done if preconceived idealism is removed from one's code of procedure. In architecture, it means that the building process must become the response to situations, and that architectural activity becomes the creation of a context for the situations. Both should be self-reflexive. This attitude towards architectural activity requires the client and the architect to adopt a method by which the situation can be analysed. There are a number of analytical methods that can be adopted, but as with the adoption of idealized imagery, it is important to avoid all those that have a defined end purpose. The development of one's own method is probably the best procedure, but in order to do this, it is necessary to try a number of different established methods. Before showing an example of a method of analysis, which could be applied to the mask incident, it is important to set the method within its own context in order to understand its phenomenological and political significance. Within natural phenomena, we are exposed to events that lay beyond the production methods of man and his culture. Within the mirage, we see a distortion and/or creation of an image that denies the observer the temptation to ask the question, what does the architect or artist mean? It is this question that obscures the nature of reality for the individual and simultaneously gives rise to a mystification of the architect's or artist's activity. Within the advancement of a specific culture, we can observe the development of an idiosyncratic language that is inaccessible to people that lay outside that culture.
Excuse me, is that not exactly what we're doing just now? Mystification is a good word to use to describe what we've been doing the last 20 minutes very well.
May I finish?
What I remember about what you said you were going to explain why culture is a political act that everyone practices, and you're attempting to wrap that into the terminology yet.
I'll be coming towards that, towards the end.
Perhaps you could do it with the dictionaries.
I'd like to finish. We recognize ourselves and our status by specific groupings of clothes, furniture, books, etc., which establish a code to which we either choose to conform or not. The establishment of the myth that hard work ensured a passage to heaven, or cleanliness is next to godliness, are 2 examples of the cultural language being used to specific effect. In the former example, the mill owners obtained the advantage who excused their own more relaxed lifestyle by establishing wealth as a virtue. In the latter, the appointment of health inspectors established the use of accepted values to promote a propaganda campaign. In both cases, however, the messages were exposed to, say, Arabs, the meaning would be lost. It is therefore possible to observe that the removal of oneself from a culture allows that culture to be viewed objectively. The natural phenomena, i.e. the mirage, stands outside the language system set up by any particular culture. It possesses a neutrality that allows the observer to invest and absorb meaning simultaneously. The meaning discovered within the confrontation with nature can establish contradictions within codes or language of one's own culture. The pure aesthetic beauty of the event can be equally well appreciated by the Arab or the Scotsman. There exists an axis with nature at one extreme and culture at the other. The development or advancement of culture results in the formation of codes, procedure and languages that progressively become more fragmented as the zenith of the culture's development is reached. This in turn results in an inaccessibility and alienation of not only the whole society, but increasingly in smaller and smaller groups within it, a non-voluntary devolution. This has the effect of the groups reinforcing their own values, which leads to the development of an even more idiosyncratic language. The combined total effect is one of stagnation due to a resistance against change. It is here that we can see that the nature of the culture lies in its production of an egotistical individual and society alike. Nature, at the other end of the axis, represents a non-egotistical system through its lack of cerebral demands on those that experience it. It is of interest to note that within a highly developed culture, comparatively speaking, such as our own, we observe people of talking going back to nature. At present, there are a group of artists who believe that through the study of language systems within the culture in which they work, that the new understanding of that language will allow them to be more specific in their use of a medium through which they will convey a message. It is of significance that it is only that their methods of study are of interest and not the application of their findings. The conveyance of a message or set of values fails on several levels, the two most important of which are that A, the obsession with transmitting messages allows one to assume that the message must be an advancement of or an opposition to the values of the rest of society, which places the artist into the category of one of fragmented groups caused by the advancement of the culture in which they are working. Level B failure lies in the fact that the message is transmitted using currently acceptable language system to best advantage, which automatically results in the stagnation of that society, while the direction of development is toward fragmentation through an over-refinement of the language. Within this argument, it is of importance to understand 2 points in order to make sense of the analytical method I'm about to propose as a step towards a neutral language, or architecture. 1. That if the nature and culture are placed on the same axis, nature represents an absence of ego, and culture represents the dominance of ego. 2. That nature of all events can be placed somewhere on that axis. 3. That the meaning is invested into images and not transmitted from them, unless there is a specific and therefore suspect intent on the part of the image maker. Iron ore represents material that is open to manipulation by man. The production of steel limits the openness of the iron ore situation. The Euston Tower represents a closed system, irrevocably stagnant. In order to understand the nature of the written word, I present you with some descriptions of houses, and then unfold the image of the house. Within this, there lies a fundamental observation that even the most specific language system, the written word, possesses an ambiguity as a signifier. Description 1. A stone's throw from the famous Norfolk-Suffolk Broads, the freehold Fritton home combines practicality with an attractive modern experience. The 3 bedrooms and bathroom are reached via a staircase in the corner of the large L-shaped living room. This room is an outstanding feature of the design, with a big dual aspect sitting area and a dining bay with ample space for family meals, set between a wide span of windows overlooking side and rear gardens. The kitchen, with its teak-styled fitted units, is delightful to work in, and a spacious window above the stainless steel sink gives a clear view of children at play in the garden. Description 2. The site of this home overlooks the valley of the River Waveney. There are large mature trees along the boundary and a considerable change of levels across the site. Mr. Edwards wanted a house which took advantage of these natural features and which should be suitable for retirement. For these reasons, the main living, eating and sleeping areas are on the first floor, and the lower ground floor is dug into the ground so that part of the bedroom end is actually at ground level. This gives the impression of a bungalow with a basement. It was decided that apart from the study, the lower floor should consist of working or traffic areas, and so the entrance hall, cloakroom, garage and utility rooms are all located here. Description 3. The curved building devised by the architect certainly fulfills the stipulation for character, and it serves to embrace the southerly aspect and make full use of the river scenery. The addition of a lower ground floor enables the house to fit astride the site without a change of level within the building, and the entrance is from this level. The first thing a visitor sees on approaching the house is the curved brick wall which contains a spiral staircase linking all the floors. Description 4. This distinctive house offers an unusual but intriguing contrast to the surrounding properties. Many of brick construction, vast tile-hung areas on the road frontage are picked out boldly in white frames to accentuate the various roof pitches demanded by the unconventional layout beneath. Some site problems were encountered as the house is built over the foundations of the former Duchess of Kent naval barracks and the defence moat which surrounded the original city of Portsmouth. This is the best one. Description 5. Ide Hill overlooks the Bowbet Reservoir and commands a view of the south and west weald of Kent. It is here that Mr. and Mrs. Chester Barrett have built their new home. The design was something of a challenge for both the architect and his clients. Their former home was a Georgian stone farmhouse, and they wanted the same degree of elegance and beauty in their new house. The house is in a prominent position, and it was essential, therefore, that it should not be intrusive, and great care has been taken to blend it into the surroundings. It is essential to my argument to understand the value of the ambiguity within our language systems, and particularly with reference to the formation of an analytical method which will form the basis for the architect and the client's activity. The architect/artist who is attempting to understand the language system within our culture can have a number of reasons for doing so. Amongst these are those that conceive a duality within reality, i.e., the reality perceived by the individual and that imposed on the individual by society. One type of architect or artist, with some justification, state that their objective is to create solely within the realms of their own individual realities. As a result, their work becomes an internalized expression of an inaccessible perception of the world. As architects, their work remains purely at the level of drawings. Another type of architect will investigate the world of semiotics in order to be able to create a greater accuracy within their choice of medium. This immediately brings into question the content of their statements. For some, the understanding created through analysis is used to disseminate their own individual realities to a preconceived receptive audience. For others, it allows the opportunity to give a greater awareness of the subliminal influences on each person within a particular culture, created by the language and sign systems of that culture. In other words, it gives them the opportunity for an equal voice. It is this last use that gives us an initial link between image, behavior, and politics. And therefore, the remaining question is whether or not the attempt at disseminating awareness is the best political use of the architect or artist's understanding. I do not want to answer that question now, but instead return to the question of ambiguity. The limitations of semiotics as a means of analysis lies in the fact that the architects and artists that make use of it assume that there is a specific meaning behind any particular language system. I maintain that this is not so, and the conception of an investment of meaning into experience holds the basis for the architect's new activity. If we accept there is no common meaning, apart from that imposed on us by history, it allows us to see the value of an individualized analytical method when seen in the context of the proposed acceptance of what is occurring at the time, as opposed to selecting what is about to occur. This ambiguity occurs at all levels. In the Department of Physics at the University of Reading, many experiments have been performed in order to discover the nature of destabilized images. Messages are incorporated into a flashing light, which leave their traces on the retina long after the light has gone out. The results of experiments show that different people see different images. This effect has not been explained, although it is possible that it is a purely physiologically controlled response. A similar effect can be obtained with auditory signals. Likewise, each person reports a different experience. At the larger end of the scale, we can observe differing reports on experiences of films or accidents. I am attempting to show that the individual's conception of any event varies according to their own life experience, physical conditions at the time of the event, and perhaps even physiological makeup. I feel the evidence for this is too great to be ignored if one is attempting to define specific language systems that possess common meaning. However, Venturi battles on, producing architecture generated by his observations of culture and its signs and symbols. All he succeeds in doing is creating a cultural fix that inhibits the individual response to an ever-changing present. The lower body. In order to avoid cultural fixes or stagnation, it is important for the architect/artist to search for methods of reaching beyond the limitations imposed on the individual by the expected responses to a public cultural language. This may be achieved by placing people in new situations beyond their experience, as in the case of the secret room and mask affair, as previously described. This method can only be successful if the individual or client experiencing the situation has been encouraged to either develop or invent a method by which the situation can be analysed. Because if this is not done, the individual experiencing the phenomena will unwittingly retreat into the security of the confines of their culture and attempt to change their relationship with the event with a prescriptive role and not one of acceptance. The client relationship with the architect is thereby changed to a state where the architect's major job is to allow the client to dictate a brief for a building or house that is not determined by the effects of the culture, its language, or systems. I believe this would promote an attitude towards building that would allow them to become self-reflexive. Within this proposed system, the act of understanding the semiological nature of society is reduced to a specific function, which is to allow the architect to talk in terms of comparisons between the new experience and the subliminal effect of the non-experience imposed by society's expected reality or conformity. The role of the personal and private ambiguity found within images and events is the only shred of hope to be utilized by the architect or artist in any attempt to give their activities a broader working base within society. The Euston Tower is the point at which society imposes its reality. The steel is the point at which the individual reality is most creative. The iron ore is the point at which speculation or response is not required. When the architect or artist today understands the liberation of working within the post-conceptual era, it is then possible to make the link between the image, both real and reported, behavior and politics. I use the term post-conceptual in the sense that there is a requirement to make use of understanding gained through an indulgence of theory, or in theory. We are now in the position to see beyond the identification of theory and put it into practice. A danger of an over-concern for theory lies in the fact that the specialized vocabulary that arises from its study, i.e. semiology takes on its own cultural connotations and thereby destroys the original accuracy of its use. In other words, the demystifying activity of the architect or artist becomes absorbed into the generalized and mystified language of society, thereby defeating its own object. It has been established that images, objects, and experience have both specific and ambiguous connotations to the individual and to groups of individuals. It is possible that through the study of these connotations, that the nature of the specific connotation could be understood and used to allow the public to become aware of the subliminal language to which they are subjected. This is therefore a direct and conscious political act, although within it lies the objection that the new demystified language becomes a mere third language, which in turn becomes absorbed by society rather than inspiring direct action. It if we concentrate on making use of the ambiguous connotations, there is obviously no point in trying to understand them, but it is possible to understand how to make use of them. On the simplest level, it's possible to state that the more alienated the image or experience is from the accepted culture, the more ambiguous the response. It is precisely this point that makes such a nonsense of the groups of architects and artists who indulge in the question of space and its languages. They hope to be able, through the study of space, to produce a space that communicates on a specific level. As space as a form of language is in its nature the producer of extreme ambiguous connotations, it makes the quest for specific use a very dubious one. I propose that it is possible for the architect to produce situations for the client that allows the client to step outside their normal frame of reference by being forced to participate in the process where it becomes irrelevant. To this situation, the proposed or similar method of analysis is applied, which forms the basis of a brief from which the architect and/or client can work. Through this method, I'm questioning the idea of a finished product, and as architect, I reserve the right to leave the client at any stage, as this would be necessary at one point anyway, unless I'm prepared to live with the client for the rest of his life or mine. It is the idealized image of a final product that has formed the basis for the establishment of the specific language that forms the social reality that is expected of the occupant. Through this method, the architect is consciously allowing a different behavior pattern to emerge, which in turn results in the client/customer perceiving society in a formerly unknown fashion. The central element in this argument is that the individual's behavior is observed by other individuals, and with time this becomes the accepted norm or code. Therefore, by allowing the client to see, analyze and act results in distortions to the codes, which are observed by others. However, through making use of the ambiguous connotations, we find in unusual or ex-cultural events the provision is made by which the behavior of the individual avoids becoming the norm or specific code. The act of rejecting finished products and concentrating on the production of ex-cultural events as a means of forming a brief is therefore a direct political act on the part of the architect. The reason for this is that current political action is only successful due to the subliminal language and codes that exist, which allows us to have a classified society without having to make it obvious through delineation. Once a new behavior is established, the subtlety of the political message is wasted. It is possible through this system to envisage the possibility of political reformation formed through the activity of the people, and possibly avoid the situation in other countries where new forms of art and architecture are being produced to fit in with a new political ideology. I'll present a selection of work done within the last month, illustrating some of the directions the architect could take. House 1. In this example, the home is being built as a result of an exercise where a group of clients take it in turns to add one element to a common house at a time. After a specific time period, the result is surveyed, and each client uses the unfinished object as the starting point for the design of their house. House 2. This is a second exercise. The clients formed themselves into groups of 3, each of whom assumed a specific role. They were the architect, the client, and the advertising agent. Each group was supplied with a 300mm cube. The procedure was circular, whereby the architect gave an instruction to the client using only 2-dimensional images. The client then interpreted the instruction by adding built elements to the cube. The advertising agent was then invited to popularize the built forms by producing adverts which would form the brief for the architect's next instruction to the client. After a selected period of time, the activity stops, and the incomplete house forms a starting point for the client to develop their own house. House 3. This is the third exercise. The clients were paired. Each individual was asked to invent a 24-hour behavioral pattern and describe it on a prepared chart. The charts were exchanged between members of a pair, and the building activity divided into half-hour periods. Each client took it in turns to translate the other's behavior pattern into a built form. After a specific period of time, the incomplete house forms the starting point for the client's completion of the house design. This is a neutral space production method. Lines are drawn on paper by the architect in the presence of the client. The paper is then screwed up and photographed. The photograph is produced on an overexposed print, which allows the lines to produce volumetric space. This space is then clarified by the architect via a model, which is presented to the client. FlexiCube. This set of images is currently beyond my comprehension. Footnote. The analytical method for use and acceptance of the experience or event works in the following manner. 1. The situation is recorded in writing. 2. Every observation of the situation and its experience is listed. 3. For each observation stated, an opposite statement is made. 4. Each pair of statements are representative of the 2 axes of a graph. 5. The point of imagined maximum comfort is plotted on the graph. 6. The account of the situation is rewritten, but this time modified by the positioning of the comfort spots on the graph. It's time for tea.
We're talking about the story on the wall, the one which is set in Dorset. It's for us. It's an expression of lots of critiques and things that we find we have to take into account in the sort of situation we find ourselves as architects. And so, I think most of the things we're commenting on aren't actually usually considered architecture. Did we lose architecture? No. Shall we scream something out?
No. Come, let's go.
you know something about?
I think this is actually it's a real site in Dorset, which the army occupied for quite a long time, and there are all these very particular characteristics which it has as a result of that, which we'll talk about maybe as we go through the story. But it's mainly, I think, a response to the idea of trying to place a settlement on a piece of land, which is something that's been done throughout time. It's a kind of recurring architectural problem, which probably usually starts with a discussion or thinking about ideals. And all the ideals that we could think of, perhaps in a kind of contemporary way of approaching that problem, always seem to come back to having to think out certain attitudes which underlie them. And this piece of work was not so much a proposal. In fact, I don't think any of the pieces of work are really proposals so much as questions or probings.
We have sort of a great aversion for problem solving, because usually it's the terms of definition of the problems which are at fault. And so, I mean, it's calling it a problem. So to go through this is sort of, it's sort of a mock development of that piece of land, incorporating the things which we consider underlying themes or underlying sort of values which aren't usually sort of spoken about, but
are there.
Yeah, they're always there behind. They're sort of cultural assumptions that we feel sort of have to be made explicit.
Yeah. So the story is set up as though the time is now, and the whole kind of, there's certain disillusionment with culture as it is, or society as it is, and the kind of typical institutional reaction to that would be to try and strengthen what actually does exist, that kind of conservative response.
Sort of a festival of Britain, which would be to reinstate values which are
already in existence.
And so we.
So.
The story was sort of that situation happened, and that then there were six monuments which were the epitomization of sort of various values. There was a cemetery of hierarchical social order, triumphal arch of professionalism, museum of conveniently classified culture, temple of consumerism, sanctuary of applied morals, and fortified headquarters of the special branch of popular harassment.
I mean, it's in a way, its crudity is kind of intentional, because it was for us a kind of once and for all gesture of actually making some statement in which we covered just about everything that we thought was basic to why we couldn't carry out a kind of a scheme in the way that one was supposed to approach it. And so it's just an attempt to demystify all those underlying values. And the architecture, kind of, it came fairly intuitively, and it was to do with certain things we were very interested in at the time. And these, I think that when we start to talk about them, they'll be seen to exist through a lot of the work.
There's sort of a dual process all the time. There's a sort of love-hate thing. One is being critical, and yet you can't help enjoying the process of what you're doing, and the actual designing, it's still something you enjoy.
Should we get on to this?
Well, the story sort of summarised very briefly. The festival sort of happened, and the monuments were built, and they were so explicit that from the grand opening onwards, the whole site was rejected and became ruins. So it's actually drawn as ruins.
This is a slide of the cemetery, which was supposed to kind of embody those assumptions about the kind of structure of society, and also the groups which I don't know, it's almost like when you talk about middle class housing or, you know, mass housing or whatever, that one's talking about categories which actually you can't quite relate to within the terms of your own experience, that your own experience is always much more subtle and elusive than that. And yet, in your architectural role, you're supposed to be dealing with those kind of quantities. And that seemed to be one of the kind of dilemmas that we were in at the time.
So the cemetery is surrounded by working class graves which are all absolutely identical with the same inscription on them. And in the centre is the earthworks, which is another thing which was sort of just sort of like, I mean, the idea of working with land. And the earthwork has a staircase going up it, which is the staircase of bourgeois aspirations, which leads up to the bourgeois tombs, and a ziggurat which spirals up towards an elitist club in the Empire style, but never quite makes it because the staircase becomes ruined. That's the bourgeois tombs. I mean, it's quite obvious. I missed one. The next one was the triumphal arch of professionalism. I think it speaks for itself, really.
I think, well, it's a ruined but still triumphal structure in which all the historic, or some of the historic ideals of architecture and planning are still kind of embodied. There's the idea of the garden city at the top and the kind of space, free space, and below that, and kind of hints at Corbusier and hints at various other things. And
I think it's to do with sort of a professional attitude being that of ensuring its own survival by expressing itself in its works. So it's not sort of, it's sort of like propaganda because each style has that quality.
I think the thing about professionalism is something we'll probably return to, but just as a kind of aside, there seems to be in all these ideas there's this notion of the user having some kind of freedom, and they're all kind of aspiring to somehow cope with those kinds of freedoms. But and you get things like, I was just reminded of this by the Pilotus, it's the free use of the space under the building, and you have the free facade and the free plan. And it all embodies those kinds of assumptions that still the architect gives those freedoms and still limits them. And at the end of this piece of work, so in some of our later stuff, I think that we're trying very hard not to do that. And so that our own processes are kind of different.
I think, yeah, and talking about professionalism, when one sort of, that's a process where one person does something for someone else. And we feel that one almost has to do as well. Like you have to be able to live in what you're talking about, and you have to actually live through it. So I think it was to do with the drawings in this series, but one has to. I mean, one can't be alien from what one's talking about. Confuse that a bit.
This is called the Museum of Conveniently Classified Culture, and it's a sunken square in the landscape approached by a staircase with an arcade all around it, and at the back of the arcade just lines of cells, each of which contains an artwork of some kind or other. And it's the access of the audience to that artwork is through that machine in the middle, which is a culture classifier. And it's something to do with the idea of so much of experience and history has already been classified, and that's the way it's accessible to you, and somehow your own, it's this idea of history as a kind of objective phenomenon, whereas I think our own feelings about history is that it's only relevant when it's something to do with your relationship with it. It's your own interpretation of past events or past things is what really counts.
I think that's a theme which underlies which underlies most of the work. It's to do with one's relationship with one's culture. It's not actually overlaid on you. It's something which is there, which is up to you to make sense of and to interpret as best suits yourself. It hasn't got a finite truth of its own.
I suppose there's also the recognition that that actually buildings and environment and the design of spaces and one's attitude to the idea of space all actually contributes to those kind of situations, and that, you know, that it's a responsibility to try and come to grips with it, really.
That's the interior of the museum with the artwork, which can only be approached individually after consulting the classifier, so you can't actually put your own history together. Very cynical sort of approach. That's the Temple of Consumerism, which is a supermarket on a hill with a ring of classical columns for some cultural credibility. And the actual supermarket is sort of purple plastic marble, sort of once again trying to appear something that's not. And inside there were holograms of consumer products rather than the real thing, sort of to tantalize you, but actually they were unattainable. And it's got a circular B road around it, which only goes to the car park and back to the supermarket and to the car park again. It's quite literal. In the centre, it's the monument to profit and gain, the shrine for profit and gain. This is the what is it?
Sanctuary of Applied Morals. At the bottom, an amphitheatre of hedges which are clipped into kind of confessionals which you have to approach through, leading up to a ruined chapel, kind of Christian virtues embodied there in stone, imported specially, and some strange dominant modern building at the top, which is the Chamber of Judgment, which has this kind of cosy domestic exterior, which actually seems to allow it to occupy that kind of moral advantage. So,
back to you. Now, let's have the slides. And the final one is the fortified headquarters of popular harassment, which was on a corner of the site, which would have been the last area that the army occupied, and it was the last area for the explosives to be cleared away from. And so it was this dangerous sort of secret place that one couldn't gain access to, and was just aware of its sort of smoky qualities and its sort of frankness. It was very much to do with one's relationship between, or one's sort of feelings, but not knowing about sort of forces of repression. And the interior, there's a series of speculations because, I mean, it was impossible to get inside to actually find out. I mean, it could have been just a harmless theatre prop, or temple of nature, or something more sinister.
So anyway, that all kind of set up some kind of background. It didn't, in a way, solve anything for us, or obviously for anybody else. But it created a space for us to do for kind of future work, and in a way for us it was the statement about our context, which meant that we didn't have to keep justifying and explaining for ourselves what it was we were responding to, because one way or another it was there.
Yeah, it was sort of having once been said, one was then sort of freed, or personally freed. I mean, I don't think it does it for anyone else. But to be able to do sort of, well, what turned out to be much smaller, much sort of more sort of personally sensitive things that we really sort of quite believed in.
I think the next kind of subject that we really got interested in was we described this area of work as archaeology, but it's a kind of not a real archaeology of the past, more a kind of archaeology of the present. We were thinking about, again, it's to do with the interpretation of things that are around you, that they're not the objects or buildings or any kind of artifacts in themselves don't particularly carry a meaning. It's the one which you allow them to have, which is what counts. But it was the notion that we will readily accept what objects mean and how to use them and the use of space and all sorts of things. But that there was still this potential for the user to actually change all that somehow. So
it was to do with appropriating the world around you.
Yeah.
So it turned out to be a very clumsy concept because we found, sort of talking to a group of people about it, one says archaeology and gives one's own definition, but you immediately find that each person there has got a totally different concept of what the word means, which is quite nice in a way, because it means that one almost has to accept that your conversations are only sort of colliding on various sort of terms and the each personal. This was, I think we've only got 2 slides from this piece of work, but it was to do with the myth of an archaeologist exploring something which had a whole lot of different levels. And there was a reality which was something sort of just quite small, which one happens to have made, and yet you can treat it with all the ritual and sort of sanctity of something from the past. It might not just have been a motorbike and a tram. It could have been sort of anything. I think most of the work we've sort of done in the last year or so is with sort of term houses. I mean, not because they are traditional houses, but because
they're not.
Yeah, because the space one lives in, which is what a house is. I mean, and that space is sort of.
Who was wheeling this wheelbarrow with a sail on it across the Sahara Desert for some reason, only known to himself, but it seemed to bear some kind of relationship with the reasons that we might make a kite, or the reasons the archaeologists might be digging up something, using some odd overlay of their own, like that grid. And there are all sorts of things, like, I think it's the next one, actually.
Yeah.
These people here digging down to some other kind of cultural thing which they're going to interpret later, and in fact they're making spaces of their own, very like their own kind of living rooms. It's really hard sometimes to try and explain all this logically, because that's not how it happened. But anyway, there are all these lots of feelings about how you could actually relate to a space that was somehow to do with your very own immediate lifestyle and your own aspirations. And I guess in a way this could have been a house for Pete and I when we were flying a kite. It's just a little kind of rather large cage at the front and a tunnel, and then a space, and somewhere off on the edge of the next hill a staircase with a platform at the top. So in fact they're all architectural elements which a non-kite flyer might come and interpret in a completely different way, but for a kite flyer and maker would actually add up to some kind of living space. Can you get awfully muddled up?
There's a lot to do with it being to do with the ground too. Like it was almost the opposite of the action, or the sort of. I mean, it's the physically building something doesn't usually embody what you do with it. It's nearly always the opposite, and this was sort of locked in the ground. It was a cage, and yet it was a space for sort of a very sort of transcendental metaphor, maybe, of sort of earth.
But going back to the notion of it as a house, I mean, I think for us we could have quite readily accepted that notion of it and called it a house, which, if you refer that back to a Parker Morris description of a house or an estate agent's description of a house, would actually have really different qualities to it, and somehow it seems that the whole purpose of doing the work is to just loosen up those kind of approaches and to be trying to deal with the making of architecture without relying on those cultural assumptions which always lead you to what's happening anyhow.
Well, this is another house which was very much to do with the experience of an actual place. I mean, I think like the fact that we've sort of made a few kites and enjoy flying them, this was to do with finding this tower and just having a very strong feeling for a place. It was to do with almost a ritual sort of subjective link between you and a place which you can't actually describe or communicate because it's just something that happens. And the place was very much to do with wind and with sort of openness and being alone, and there's also some swans who lived there and left their feathers in the foreground. And this is sort of a speculation of a possible occupation of that place on a sort of longer scale. It's called sort of a house for a birdman, although I think birdman is a bit too sort of science fiction-like. It's very much just to do with the ritual of occupying a space and how you feel when you're there. The actual house was a series of staircases which all go up to, like, they almost go to the tower, but there's a gap between, so that they're all just going up to the air. And there's one inside which goes up and out a little hole, and one underneath. And there's an attic on the third level, which is the only bit of it which is anything like a sort of traditional house. It sort of has hooks for bowler hats, and your suits hang on the wall. And you're sort of almost your memories, as you usually have in an attic. And in the little space above the attic could even be a spare pair of wings. There's a perch which comes from the attic, which is sort of kind of little door. And sort of, well, if it was a birdhouse, the bird would use the perch. But if it's a human house, it just leaves a lot of space open for interpretation. There's a feather bed and a scratching pit and a splash bath. And the actual tower, which is there, is as it was found. It's like a chapel, sort of just to what it is. There's a few sort of less built form things, or probably more built form because we actually made them. Things that one just does as part of the process of going through these thoughts. Like this is a kite chair, which is once again to do with the ambiguity of a sort of simple concept like a chair, like a flying chair. I mean, is it a flying object, or it's both, but it's lots of other things.
It's actually quite hard to handle the idea of this as a piece of furniture, just because of it's quite enormous, and just to use it in a room would have actually involved you in really trying to work out what the room was again.
And almost a ritual use of the chair too, like it's big enough.
I don't know, it seems that if you kind of obsessively magnify any activity, there's some kind of space that fits it, and there seems to be a converse to that our kind of everyday life is almost generated by the spaces that we get to be using. There seems to be, this kind of real trap, this cultural fix that spaces fall into.
That's a brick version of the same kite chair.
We thought we'd discovered the archetypal chair.
That was done for a friend too, which was a nice way of sort of treating architecture sort of as a gift that you both take part in and you both help make and sort of talk about.
Might as well talk about that one.
That was another gift for a friend, which was very much to do with something she's sort of into, which is this. It's to do with space being a sort of. It's something which our everyday lives sort of occupy almost for our whole life, and space being the sort of medium of our lives almost, and it's both architecture and the actions that you do in it. And this was a headset for her, which was for occupying black space. There's a few little photographs at the top of it being worn. picnic.
There was just a time when we were quite hung up on the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, but realising that it was our obsession with them which was making them what they were, and not what they'd been built as, 40 years ago. And so finally we made models of them, which was partly to find out what they looked like, really. But we made them as picnic hampers so that we could somehow use them in some kind of activity which just related to things that we do anyhow.
They're quite cumbersome in a bus queue, though.
Should we carry on? Because there are some more notes. Carry on again. Yeah. It's really funny because when we had that picnic, all the kids who were in that park at the time, they just accepted it completely.
Yeah.
It wasn't
They said, "What is it?" And we said, "A lunchbox." And they said, "Okay," and it didn't work.
But
same obsession used for a housing scheme. That was the Roosevelt Island competition for New York.
But there were some really nice flats there. The ones on the bottom would have glass floors. And all the elevators would go sideways. I think there's one of the things that we maybe try to do is not to treat the spaces that we design as in any sense an answer, because we never started out by defining a problem, but instead to try and set up at least our drawings as questions, or perhaps the idea of those spaces as trying to provoke a response in terms of an idea of how to use them or how to convert them or adjust them by some other kind of architectural notion overlaid on that.
I think too, these sort of conversations sound very personal, but it's in fact, one can't talk about the world without talking about oneself. I think that's sort of an answer to something Will said, like, I don't think subjectivity as a sort of source for what one does is a retreat into oneself. I think it's something which involves everyone and sort of can be shared.
Is that the end?
Yeah. That's the end.